Some places keep their history quietly under an ordinary afternoon. A paved loop through hardwoods, a shallow lake with lily pads at the edge, a small golf course, a beach, families with dogs. This is Cleary Lake Regional Park in Prior Lake, Minnesota, on the southern edge of the Twin Cities. It is one of the gentlest parks in the metro, but the ground beneath this trail was carved by ice, cleared by a plow, and taken from a nation that never left and is still here today. Look for the place where the Minnesota River bends northeast toward its meeting with the Mississippi. Just south of that bend is Scott County, created in 1853 and named for General Winfield Scott. Inside it sits the city of Prior Lake, about 25 miles southwest of downtown Minneapolis. Cleary Lake Regional Park covers roughly 1,100 acres of woods, wetland, and old farm ground, wrapped around a lake of about 140 acres. A 3.5-mile paved loop rings the water. Notice the shape of the land first, because everything else follows from it. This is not flat country and it is not hill country. It is lumpy. Low swells of gravel and sand, shallow bowls holding water, a lake that sits in a hollow with no great river feeding it. That texture has a name. Geologists call it dead ice moraine, and it is the fingerprint of a glacier that stopped, stalled, and rotted in place. To understand this park, you have to start with the ice. Around 14,000 years ago, a tongue of the Laurentide ice sheet pushed down out of Canada through the Red River lowland and kept going, all the way to the site of Des Moines, Iowa. Geologists call it the Des Moines Lobe. It was the last great ice to cross this part of the continent. It did not grind down through hard rock like older glaciers. It rode over soft shale and limestone, so it carried a heavy load of gray clay and gravel, and it left that load everywhere it went. The ice that reached this exact ground came by an unusual route. From the main Des Moines Lobe, far to the southwest, a branch peeled off and turned back to the east and northeast, running across the country that is now the Twin Cities and pushing on toward Grantsburg, Wisconsin. Geologists call it the Grantsburg Sublobe. It moved into land that older ice had already vacated, and it laid its debris on top of everything that came before. We are walking on that debris right now. When that ice finally failed, it did not retreat in a neat line. Great blocks of it broke away, got buried under sand and gravel washed off the melting front, and sat there insulated in the ground, sometimes for centuries. Then, slowly, each buried block melted. The sediment above it collapsed inward and left a bowl. Fill the bowl with snowmelt and rain and groundwater and you have a kettle lake. Minnesota has thousands of them. Cleary Lake is one. And it is a very shallow one. State survey figures put the maximum depth at only about 9 feet, with an average of around 5. The whole lake bed is what limnologists call littoral, which simply means that sunlight reaches the bottom everywhere. There is no cold, dark, deep water here. That is why the shoreline is thick with cattails and lily pads, why the water warms so fast in June, and why it can freeze so hard in winter. This lake is all edge. Just north of here, the ice left something far larger. As the sheet melted back, meltwater pooled behind it into an enormous lake, glacial Lake Agassiz, bigger than all the Great Lakes combined. When it found an outlet to the south, the water came through in a torrent. That river, which geologists call Glacial River Warren, cut the deep, wide valley that the modest Minnesota River wanders through today. The valley is far too big for its river. It was carved by a flood that no longer exists. When the ice let go, the land it left was raw. Gravel, clay, standing water, no soil worth the name. Tundra came first, then spruce, then pine, and over thousands of years a warming climate pushed the northern forest away and let prairie and oak advance from the south and west. For a long stretch, much of southern Minnesota burned regularly and stayed open grassland. What happened next, right here, is one of the stranger stories in North American ecology. Roughly 300 to 600 years ago, in a cooler and wetter spell, a dense hardwood forest advanced across south-central Minnesota and would not burn. It grew in the shelter of lakes, wetlands, and broken hills, natural fire breaks that stopped the prairie fires. French traders called it the Grand Bois. In English, it became the Big Woods. At its greatest extent, it covered something like 5,000 square miles, a diagonal band roughly 100 miles long and 40 miles wide. Cleary Lake sits inside it. The Big Woods was built on 4 trees: sugar maple, basswood, American elm, and red oak, with ironwood and green ash beneath them. It was shade on shade, cool in August, with spring ephemerals racing to flower before the canopy closed over them. Minnesota Dakota speakers are recorded calling this kind of country by a name that means thick woods. On the maps that surveyors drew here, the forest edge and the prairie edge weave against each other, a border that fire decided year by year. Cleary Lake sat close to that border, and it shows. Ecologists mapping the native plant communities of this park record the ground here as oak woodland, pin oak and bur oak, rather than deep maple forest. Bur oak is the tree that survives fire. Its bark is thick and corky, its roots go deep, and a grass fire that kills a young maple will leave a bur oak standing. Where you see old, wide, low-branching oaks, you are usually looking at land that once burned. So this trail runs along an old seam in the continent, the place where forest and prairie argued for centuries. That seam is exactly why people lived here. Woodland gave shelter, firewood, maple sugar, deer, and nuts. Prairie and wetland gave bison, elk, waterfowl, tubers, and grasses. And the lakes and the river gave fish, wild rice, and travel. This was not empty land waiting for anyone. It was worked, known, named, and lived in. This is Dakota homeland. The Dakota bands of the lower Minnesota River are the Mdewakanton, a name usually translated as dwellers by the Spirit Lake, a reference to Mdewakan, the water we now call Mill Lacs, from which they trace their older presence in the north. By the 1700s and 1800s, their villages lined this stretch of the Minnesota River Valley, within a morning of where we are standing. They are not a story from the past. They are neighbors of this park today. The nearest of those villages has a name we still use every day without knowing it. Tinta Otunwe, the village of the prairie, stood on the banks of the Minnesota River and grew into one of the largest Dakota communities on the lower valley. Its leaders carried the name Sac, which means the number 6. Settlers wrote it down as Shakopee. The city up the road, the county seat, is named for a line of Dakota chiefs, and most people who drive through it have no idea. Names carry the memory that maps forget. Mdewakanton is not a label given by outsiders. It is what the people call themselves, and it points north to a great lake, to an older center of gravity. Across Minnesota, you can still read Dakota underneath the English. Minnesota itself comes from a Dakota phrase for the river, water with a clouded or sky-tinted quality. The language did not disappear. It is taught, spoken, and being carried forward by young people right now, a few miles from this trail. Change arrived first as commerce, not as armies. French traders were moving through this country by the mid-1600s, and for well over a century, the relationship was a trade relationship. Furs went east, and metal, cloth, and guns came west. It reshaped the economy of the region long before it reshaped the land itself. Debt built up in the trading posts, and that debt would matter enormously later when the United States sat down to buy Minnesota. The United States arrived formally in 1805, when Lieutenant Zebulon Pike negotiated what became known as the Pike's Purchase, about 155,000 acres at the meeting of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. Fort Snelling rose on the bluff above that confluence. Then came the Treaty of 1837, in which the Mdewakanton gave up roughly 5 million acres east of the Mississippi. Each agreement was smaller in appearance than what it actually cost, and each one narrowed the ground beneath these villages. Then came 1851, and the year that changed everything under our feet. At 2 councils, one at Traverse des Sioux upriver, one at Mendota near the fort, the Dakota band signed treaties ceding more than 30 million acres. In exchange, they were promised money, goods, and a reservation, a narrow strip of land along the upper Minnesota River. Much of the promised payment went straight to traders to settle claimed debts. The land that is now Scott County, this park, this trail, passed out of Dakota hands. Two years later, in 1853, the people of Tinta Otunwe were forced to leave the village of the prairie and move west to the reservation strip. Scott County was created that same year. Surveyors came, then claimed shanties, then plows. It is worth sitting with the arithmetic. In roughly 15 years, from 1837 to 1851, a homeland of tens of millions of acres was reduced to a corridor 10 miles wide, and even that corridor did not hold. On the reservation, the annuity payments came late or not at all. The game was gone, the crops failed, and traders refused credit to hungry families. In August 1862, that pressure broke into open war. The United States-Dakota War lasted about 6 weeks. Hundreds of settlers were killed, and so were Dakota people. It ended in defeat for the Dakota, and in a punishment that Minnesota is still reckoning with more than a century and a half later. On the 26th of December, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged together at Mankato. It remains the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. That same winter, more than 1,000 surviving Dakota, mostly women, children, and elders, were marched over 100 miles to a prison camp on the river flats below Fort Snelling, where many died. In 1863, Congress abrogated every treaty with the Dakota and ordered them removed from Minnesota entirely. Two Dakota leaders had escaped north. Sac, called Little Six, and Wackanazanzan, called Medicine Bottle, were seized near the Canadian border in 1864, drugged and carried back across the line. They were tried, and on the 11th of November, 1865, they were hanged at Fort Snelling. That is why Dakota people today speak of the 38+2, and why riders and runners still travel to Mankato each December in the cold to carry that memory forward. Removal was the policy. It was not in the end the outcome. Some Dakota families never left Minnesota. Some slipped back. They lived for decades without land, without recognition, and often without safety, in a state that had put a bounty on them. It is one of the hardest and least told stretches of Minnesota history, and it is the necessary bridge between the catastrophe of 1862 and the community that lives around this park today. In the 1880s, Congress finally appropriated funds for the Dakota who had remained in Minnesota. Between roughly 1886 and 1891, the federal government bought land for them, including parcels here in the Prior Lake area. It was a small return, a few hundred acres for a homeland of 30 million, but it was ground held for Dakota people in the valley they came from, and everything that follows grew out of it. For most of the next century, it stayed small and poor. Then, on the 28th of November, 1969, the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community was federally recognized as a sovereign tribal nation. It had 33 members. Its first chairman was Norman M. Crooks. That recognition is the legal hinge of the modern story. It gave the community the standing to govern itself, to hold land, and to build an economy on the same river valley their ancestors were expelled from. In 1982, the community opened the Little Six Bingo Palace. In 1992, it opened Mystic Lake Casino Hotel, a few miles from where we are walking. Gaming, exercised as a right of sovereignty, transformed the community's position completely. Today, the SMSC and its enterprises are collectively the largest employer in Scott County. It holds roughly 2,000 acres, in and around that original reservation land, and it has donated more than $350 million to causes across Indian country. What they have done with it matters more than the numbers. Wozupi Tribal Gardens, Wozupi means garden in Dakota, grows more than 50 certified organic crops and orchard fruit on land nearby. Seeds of Native Health is a national campaign to improve native nutrition. In 2019, the community opened Hakakata Tea, its cultural center. And in 2023, it brought back a bison herd, a gift from the Sisseton Wapit and Oye, on 165 acres of restored prairie. Which brings us back to this specific ground, and what happened to it in between. After 1853, the big woods around Cleary Lake was cut. Hardwood went to lumber and firewood, stumps came out, and the black soil beneath grew wheat, then corn, then dairy pasture. The lake became a farm lake. Fences ran to its shore. By local accounts, the name Cleary comes from one of the farming families who held this land, and the name simply stayed on the water. The town that gave this park its address arrived on rails. In 1872, the Hastings and Dakota line of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad was completed through here, across land owned by a railroad man named Charles H. Pryor. The lake beside the tracks had been called Long Lake. It was renamed for him, and the town took the lake's new name. A post office opened that same year. The village was surveyed in 1875, and Pryor Lake incorporated in May of 1891. For decades, Pryor Lake was two things at once: a farm town and a lake resort where people came out from the cities on the train for the water and the summer. Then the metro grew south. Farms became subdivisions, the fields went under, and by the mid-20th century the open country around these lakes was disappearing fast. That pressure is what created this park. Somebody looked at the map and realized that if nobody bought the green, there would be none left. The instrument already existed. In 1957, Minnesota created what was then the Hennepin County Park Reserve District, a public body with the power to buy land ahead of the sprawl. In its first decade, it bought nearly 21,000 acres, most of it farmland. In 2001, it was renamed Three Rivers Park District for the Mississippi, the Minnesota, and the Crow. Today, it stewards more than 27,000 acres, 20 parks, and 10 regional trails. Cleary Lake was assembled in the 1970s as Scott County and the Metropolitan Park System bought up farm ground around the water and turned it into public land. What went in reflects exactly what a suburb needed: a swimming beach, a 9-hole executive golf course with a driving range, 22 campsites, a 28-acre fenced-off leash dog area, 6 miles of ski trails for winter. Since a joint powers agreement signed in December 2010, Scott County and Three Rivers Park District have run it together. And so this is what a rescued landscape looks like. Not wilderness. Second-growth oak and maple over old field lines, prairie plantings where the corn was, wetland margins thick with cattail. Great blue herons work the shallows. Turtles line up on half-sunk logs. Deer move at the wood edge in the last hour of light. It is a small ecology, hard used and coming back, which is the honest condition of almost everything green in a metropolitan area. A trail like this one asks very little of you. 3.5 miles, flat, paved, families and joggers and strollers. It is easy to walk it and see nothing but a nice afternoon. But the hollow that holds this water was left by a block of buried ice. The trees were logged and grew back. The soil was farmed and released. And the people who named this valley are, right now, a few miles up the road, farming, teaching their language and running a bison herd on restored prairie. That is the thing worth carrying out of here. History is not only in the famous places. It is in the ordinary ones, in a shallow lake at the edge of a suburb if you are willing to stand still and read it. The ice, the woods, the treaty, the plow, the railroad, the park, and the return. All of it under one quiet loop of asphalt in Scott County, Minnesota. Thank you for watching. Follow for more trails of the world.